In this next lesson, we are going to learn how to apply a landscape automaterial and what a landscape automaterial is. And to illustrate that, we should probably learn what a material is. So, for example, if you are to browse to your starter content that we added in an earlier lesson and look to materials, you'll find a bunch of default materials that come with our starter content, from brick, clay to grass ground to metal rust, and a variety of different materials. So if I was to now select my landscape in my editor window or in my outliner here, just click and select my landscape and head on over to the detail section and scroll down just a little bit, you will find the landscape material option right here. So I could, for example, click on this metal rust material and then assign it to my landscape material. And when I do this, it will apply that material to my landscape. I could, for example, apply this nice ground grass material, and we get something that looks sort of like grass ground terrain. What you will notice is when we apply these materials to our landscape, they are basically the exact same pattern repeated throughout. So for example, this grass green landscape sort of randomly darkens and lightens, and it is the same. Everywhere you look, it's that same repeating pattern everywhere. Now, a landscape automaterial is specifically for landscaping, and it is special because it will detect the height and gradation severity, for example, a steep cliff in your landscape, and it can apply a different type of material to your landscape depending on the height and gradation. The best way to understand this is to see it in action, so let's do that. Okay, fire up your Epic Games launcher, head on over to the Marketplace tab and search for Landscape Automaterial. Now, there will be a number of paid versions of Landscape Automaterial, so we are just going to filter by free. And in the free option, there's actually only one really good option to choose from, and that is the Landscape Pro 2.0. So go ahead, grab Landscape Pro 2.0 and click on Add to Project. Find your project from the list, click on it, and then click Add to Project. Now, I've already done this myself, but you can just go ahead and click Add to Project, and it will take just a moment to copy the files over. When you're done, head back to Unreal Engine Editor. Back to Unreal Engine Editor, you will now see a folder called STF. This was, of course, added when we added to project the Landscape Pro 2.0. Everything from Landscape 2.pro, whatever is in the STF folder. So let's navigate into the STF folder, and what we are going to look for is the environment folder, and then the landscape folder, and then the landscape folder again. And then from in this landscape folder, I'm just going to actually filter by material, so there's only a few to see. There are a few different material options available. We are going to choose the M_Landscape Pro V2 No Tessellation material. And so this is a landscape material. This looks something like this if you open it up. Rather complicated, all sorts of nodes and various configuration options. Luckily, we don't have to learn this. This is much more advanced when it comes to landscaping and environmental design. Not something we are going to be touching in this beginner's course, so no worries there. Instead, all we are going to be doing is using this landscape material, which has already been nicely pre-created for us for use in our project. And what we're going to do is create an instance of this material. So an instance is basically a copy of the material that can be modified. It can be edited. You can create multiple instances out of a single material, and each one could be a little bit different, for example. But in order to create a material instance, all you need to do is right-click on the material and go Create Material Instance. Go ahead and give your material instance a name, something like My Landscape Instance, something like that. And now we've got our landscape instance. Now, if we open our material instance, what you will notice is that instead of getting all those nodes and various other confusing looking parameters, what we have instead is a nice list of various settings that we can modify. For example, the landscape terrain color, the rock texture, all sorts of various things, which we'll touch on in just a bit. For now, the first thing that we're going to want to do is we are going to want to assign our landscape material instance to our landscape so that it actually shows. let's go over to our outliner. Make sure our landscape is selected. You can also, of course, simply select the landscape by clicking on it in your Unreal Engine editor window. Then go to the Details panel, and from there, look to the Landscape Material section. So it's near the top, just scroll down a little bit, and you'll find the Landscape Material section. From here, make sure your Landscape Material instance is selected, and then simply click the little arrow to assign that Landscape Material instance to your landscape. Now, it may seem like Unreal Engine is freezing and not responding. That's okay, just give it a minute. It will respond momentarily. So when you first add your material instance to your landscape, it will look something like this, hazy day. So we do need to do one more step in order to actually make this landscape material work, and that is to go back into our landscape editing mode. And from within our landscape editing mode, head over to the paint option, and within the paint option, scroll down until you see the layers option. Right now, what we have is a bunch of layers which say none, 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 none. So what we want to do is we want to create a layer info for each of these layers. Starting with the top one, let's go ahead and click the little plus icon and click on Weight Blended Layer. Go ahead and just save that. You can save that into the default folder that it recommends. Give it a moment to do its thing. It may again look like it's freezing, but just be patient. And then momentarily you should see the landscape start to fill in with landscape material. So let's go ahead and now do this also for all of the other layers in our layers section. Just go ahead and click the little plus icon, click on Weight Blended, click through, and add the various weight blended layers. Okay, when you're done, give it a nice File Save All. That will save all the files that we just created. Okay, so as we take a look around, you may notice that there is a certain interesting feature of this landscape Automaterial, and that is that depending on the gradation and severity of our cliff and terrain height, the landscape material will change its texture from a cliff to a more grass-looking texture. So for example, if I was to go back into Sculpt over here, grab my Sculpt tool, and pull up some of the landscape, you will notice that depending on the severity of the slope, we get either cliff or we get grass terrain. Flatter grass, steeper cliff. You'll also notice that we have some procedural grass that's been generated in our environment. So that just comes with the landscape Automaterial. Now we can affect what grass is being shown, but I'll get to that in just a bit. Another interesting thing to note is that all of the procedural grass adapts and conforms to the landscape. So if I was to paint a mound, the grass would be removed from underneath that mound, and it would now just be placed over top of that mound, where appropriate to do so. Of course, the grass isn't programmed to grow on cliffs, so it will just grow where it is meant to grow. And once again, settings like that can be adjusted, tweaked, and modified to your needs, which we will take a look at a little bit more later. And you know what I'm going to do here? I'm actually going to go into our lighting, and I'm going to disable our exponential height fog for the moment so that we don't have this foggy layer over our terrain as we work on it. It'll be a little bit more easy to make out what we're doing that way. Okay, let's now take a look again at our material instance. If you remember, we opened this a little bit earlier. And if you forgot how to find it, just look for your My Landscape instance. Remember what you named it? Just do a little search for your name of your material instance. And let's go ahead and open up that material in its own window. Now, when you first open it, it will probably appear something like this with this material instance example that will be black. I usually don't even use that part. I just kind of pull over there and hide it. And then I kind of move that to the side. And that way I can work on my material instance editor window and also see what's going on with my landscape in the background. So when you're dealing with material instances, there is no particular rule of thumb for how they are organized and arranged. All of these different variables and parameters that you can configure within the material instance are actually created by whoever created the material. So in this case, the developer of Landscape Pro 2.0 decided that he liked this particular configuration for how to lay out all the different sections and values and variables within the material instance. So what you typically have to do when you're using material instance is, number one, you could consult the documentation, but you can also just sort of look around. Typically, these are laid out in such a way to make a certain amount of sense. And as you become more familiar what the different options and features do, it will just start to make a little bit more sense. Right now, I imagine it looks a little bit daunting, but don't worry about that, because landscaping and environmental design, and not to mention animation or sound effect design or music design, there's so many areas to Unreal Engine game creation that you are not necessarily expected to be a master of all. Typically, what you will find yourself doing is figuring out how to use certain pre-made components and then focusing on what you want to focus on. Maybe you want to focus on landscape and environmental design and do a course entirely on learning how to create your own landscape material. Well, that's cool. That's a whole facet of Unreal Engine design. You may want to not really worry about creating the landscapes and use like an Automaterial like we're doing here and focus more on game mechanics like combat systems or something like that. That's cool too. So don't worry about mastering everything. For now, having a general knowledge of how things are put together and how to sort of tweak things is going to be enough to get you going. But let us start by doing something fairly simple and fairly grand when it comes to the overall aesthetic of our landscape, and that is the landscape texture that's being used. Right now we have this sort of texture right here. You can see it a bit under the grass. For the cliffside, we have this sort of rocky texture over here. So right here, where you see it says base color, you'll see a number of different base color layer options. Layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, and so forth. The default landscape material is pre-programmed into the master material, but if you want to change it, all you need to do is tick on it, and then you will have the option to affect a change to that particular section of the material instance. So, for example, if I was to navigate to our Unreal Engine starter content, and if I was to look for our textures folder right here, within our textures folder, we have a bunch of different textures. So for example, right now, our landscape material is this nice sort of grassy look. But let's say I was to take something kind of silly like this brick material. This is, of course, just a flat image, a PNG image of a brick wall. And let's say I was to apply that to our base color layer. And now what you can see is that we actually have that brick texture which has been applied to our landscape. So we're basically able to affect that material. In the case of our rock face right here, you actually have to scroll down in this particular material until you find the triplanar section. So let's say we wanted to put this cobblestone into our rock face. We could just select that texture and apply it, and now we have this kind of silly looking cobblestone rock face instead. Okay, let's look a little bit more into our material instance, and then we're not going to go too much further with this because landscape environmental design is a complete course all on its own. It can be very involved, very in-depth, very detailed, and I just want to give you a general functional working knowledge in this beginner's course. So for example, like I say, a good rule of thumb is to poke around and just take a look at what everything is, right? And how do you know what it does? Well, you just try it. So for example, this triplanar details textural normal map affects the height map or the bump map or the normal map. It goes by a few names, and it basically affects the 3D look of a texture. So if I were to tick this on and choose something else for it, like I say, this cobblestone bump map, height map, normal map, right here, if I were to put this in its place instead of the default, and I don't know if you could see that happen. Let's do that one more time. I'll take it away, and then we're going to put it right back in there, and you should notice that the rocks become rounder. There we go. They get the sort of a rounding effect applied to them. That is because we are now using the height map, or rather the normal map, which is specifically for the cobblestone terrain. Now you can apply height maps that don't belong to the terrain, and you can get sort of interesting effects. Like for example, this cobblestone smooth, I could apply that height map and get a slightly different effect. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to see what's going on. Here's a nice bush. Again, you can't really see too much what's going on, but if you look closely, you can sort of see that bush pattern etched into the rock in a sort of three-dimensional way. So the height map essentially affects the 3D look of a thing. It doesn't actually change the geometry of your terrain. It just creates a sort of visual trickery that simulates a three-dimensional look. So there's the cobblestone back in place again. So like I said before, good rule of thumb, just click around the different things, try them out. For example, what's the triplanar details power layer? The default value is 1.3. What happens if we change that to 0.5? Well, we get a sort of a lighter application of our texture. Change that to 3, we get a much darker application of our texture. You can always tick the little arrow like that and then uncheck to reset to the default values. But typically speaking, it's just not a bad idea to click around and try stuff out. So here's the triplanar details, texture, scale, layer, size. So right now the default is 550. If we change that to say 1500, as you can see, the tiling actually increases by quite a bit. If I change that down to 100, well, the tiling repeats much more frequently. So click around, look around, try stuff out, experiment, and the more you do, the more you'll get familiar with all the different things, what they mean, what they do. And like I say, this is beyond the scope of a beginner's Unreal Engine course. I don't want to get lost in the weeds, as it were, and we could definitely go down the rabbit hole when it comes to landscape creation, but for now, I think it's good enough to get a functional knowledge of how things work. One issue you may notice occur is the texture streaming pool over budget error. And if you take a look at our grass now, it's kind of become low resolution. So there is a simple fix for this. Right down here in the console command, you can click and then you can type in the command r.streaming.pool size, and then you can set the amount of RAM, video RAM, that you want to make available to Unreal Engine. For myself, I usually set this to 5,000, and that seems to do the trick. After I do that, you can see that the resolution of the grass has immediately become good again, no longer low polygon looking. So without getting too complicated, I did mention that I would tell you how to deal with the grass that comes with this default auto landscape material. And again, this varies from method to method, but in this particular case, let's just navigate to STF Pack 03 Landscape Pro Base and then landscape grass type. The grass information, the meshes that are being used for the grass, is stored in this file called grass1_layer grass. So if we open that up, you will see in the details section right here a bunch of different varieties of grass. So you can actually expand one of those and even browse to it, and you can see it'll take us to the directory in our content browser which contains that particular grass mesh. If I was to drag that grass mesh out into our environment, you can see that individual grass mesh is being used. So basically, this landscape auto material is taking a few base samples of grass mesh and then applying them in a procedural way. So if, for example, I didn't want this particular grass mesh to appear at all, I could select something else in its place. Let's say this large Unreal Engine ball. That's quite silly, but there you have it. Now we've got this large Unreal Engine ball in the place where that grass mesh used to be. That doesn't look so good. Let's try this lamp instead. That might be a little easier. Okay, so now we've got this lamp in the place of that grass mesh. And if you just wanted to delete the grass, you could go right ahead and delete the grass option right there. Now there are a few additional layer information files within the same folder which also contain some of the larger shrubberies and procedural stuff. But we are actually going to be using Unreal Engine version 5.2's new PGC, procedural generated content features in order to generate a lot of our foliage and trees and grass and shrubberies and etc. etc. So we're not going to get into the automated features of this particular individual landscape auto material. Instead, we're going to learn some of the core mechanics of Unreal Engine and how to do it in that way. So I feel like I want to just finish this lesson by saying that if you didn't fully follow all of the parts of this particular lesson, that's okay. I just wanted to sort of touch on a few things in regards to using a landscape auto material. Like I said, landscape auto materials are different from material to material, so there's no hard rule of thumb. And later on in this lesson, we're actually going to be using some of Unreal Engine's new built-in procedural content generation features to generate our trees and our grass and our bushes and all that sort of cool stuff. So if you want to learn specifically about a landscape auto material, it'll sort of depend on that particular auto material, and typically auto materials from the marketplace will include a certain amount of documentation. So you can browse through and figure it out, or you can just kind of do what I do, and that is click around and figuring it out on the fly. But in this lesson, I just wanted to touch on the existence of auto materials, how they can be used, why they're incredibly useful, and how they're meant to be used in order to create a procedural and realistic looking landscape. This particular landscape material doesn't seem to have a beach layer or snow cap heights on its mountains or anything like that, but there are landscape auto materials out there that you can get which include like a beach layer or like a high snowy mountain layer, and even more complexity than I've seen in this one. This one might have those features somewhere, but like I say, each auto landscape material is different, and in order to learn all of its features, you really have to consult its documentation. Anyway, so now I think you're roughly familiar with a landscape auto material. Being aware of its existence and how it's used is enough for now, and we're going to continue to elaborate as we go on. This lesson is from my Unreal Engine Beginners course. You can get access to the entire course on my Patreon page. All of my Patreons get full access to all of my courses, and I will be adding more courses and tutorials over time. Links in the description. Thank you for all the support.